The air in the boardroom on the 42nd floor of Vanguard Peak always possessed a distinct, unmistakable scent. It was a sterile, calculated blend of lemon polish, aggressively cooled and recirculated oxygen, and the faint, metallic tang of absolute, unadulterated fear. For 15 years I had learned to breathe that specific air, learning to navigate the treacherous currents of power that flowed through the endless hallways of Vanguard Peak like high-voltage electricity. My name is Daniel. I am 48 years old, and I was the senior liaison for strategic partnerships. It was a title that sounded profoundly boring to the uninitiated, a string of corporate jargon meant to put people to sleep. But to anyone who actually understood how massive amounts of monies moved through the veins of the cities, it meant I held the keys to the kingdom. I did not shout. I never needed to raise my voice. My power resided in the heavy silence between signatures, in the subtle nod across a sprawling mahogany table, and in the orchestration of a $3 billion merger. For the past 9 months, I had spent every waking hour sculpting a masterpiece from a mountain of chaotic, disparate raw data, transforming it into a perfect symphony of corporate synergy. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the concrete canyons of the city, reviewing the final intricate clauses on my tablet when the heavy oak door slammed open. It was not merely an entrance, it was a hostile invasion. Chloe Vance, the newly appointed vice president's daughter, clacked into the room with the subtlety of a freight train. She was 24 years old, armed with a freshly printed Master of Business Administration degree that the father had likely paid a building wing to secure, and she wore a smirk that suggested she firmly believed she was the main character in a blockbuster film, while everyone else was merely fortunate to serve as background extras. It was her first day, literally her very first hour on the job. Her voice cut through the low, steady hum of the office like a serrated knife dragging across glass. She was not looking at the breathtaking view of the skyline. She was looking directly at me. Or rather, she was scrutinizing my torso. I lowered the tablet slowly, turning to face her with the practiced, absolute neutrality I typically reserve for erratic, unpredictable investors. I asked if I could help her, keeping my tone perfectly flat. She was clutching a thick, spiral-bound book. It was the employee handbook, a dusty relic from the late 90s that absolutely nobody had actually opened since the invention of the smartphone. She stated that she knew exactly who I was and what I was doing. I offered that I was reviewing the critical merger protocols for the Elias Thorne deal, keeping my voice impeccably level. She sneered, stepping closer, bringing with her an overpowering wave of cheap jasmine perfume and profound, radiating insecurity. She announced that I was violating a specific code regarding appropriate client-facing attire. I blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer absurdity of the accusation. I was wearing a vintage, bespoke Italian blazer, charcoal gray with subtle pearl buttons, paired with flawlessly tailored slacks and a distressed leather tote bag that likely cost more than her entire car. She tapped the antiquated handbook with a brightly manicured nail, insisting that the rules clearly stated standardized closures only, and she expressed extreme disdain for my bag, claiming they did not do distressed at Vanguard Peak because they represented excellence. The junior analysts in the glass cubicles outside had frozen in place, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. I kept my voice deadly calm, dropping it an octave, and informed her that I was scheduled to meet with Elias Thorne in exactly 48 hours to finalize a $3 billion acquisition. I explained that my blazer was not the issue. The issue was her blatant interruption of my critical preparation. She turned a shade of mottled red that clashed violently with her silk scarf. She was clearly not accustomed to receiving any form of pushback. She was accustomed to wielding her father's unlimited credit card and terrifying helpless interns. She announced herself as the vice president's chief of staff, throwing around a fabricated title that I knew for a fact did not technically exist for her pay grade. She claimed she was enforcing vital standards and questioned how the company could possibly trust me with its future if I could not follow basic rules. The situation was so utterly absurd that I almost laughed out loud, but I caught the dangerous, ambitious gleam in her eye. She did not care about the buttons on my jacket. She wanted a scalp. She desperately wanted to prove on her very first day that she was the apex predator of the floor. She had specifically targeted me because I looked established, and she believed that taking down the senior figure was the quickest way to terrify the rest of the pack into submission. She commanded me to go home, change my clothes, and write a formal letter of apology to Human Resources for the infraction, crossing her arms defensively. I looked at her, truly observing her face. I saw the faint tremor in her hands, the desperate clawing need for external validation, and the complete, profound lack of understanding of what my job actually entailed. I simply told her no, explaining that I had crucial work to complete. I turned my back to her, facing the window once more. Then, she shrieked the words that would ultimately destroy her career. She told me I was fired. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy, ridiculous, and completely surreal. I turned back around to face the angry woman. She was panting slightly, her eyes wide with adrenaline. She had fully committed to her catastrophic mistake. She had pulled the trigger. I told her she could not possibly be serious, not pleading, but calmly analyzing her meltdown. She yelled, her voice cracking under the strain, claiming to be my superior by proxy and accusing me of gross insubordination. She ordered me to pack my things immediately, threatening to have security escort me out of the building. I looked down at the $3 billion contract resting on my tablet, and then a strange, beautiful, cold clarity washed over my entire being. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. I told her she was absolutely right, that standards were indeed paramount. I did not wait for her to respond. She genuinely believed she had just exerted absolute dominance over the floor. She had just fired the only person in the entire hemisphere who knew how to interpret the complex handshake codes of the Thorne family. As I walked deliberately down the long hallway, I did not look back, but I could feel her staring at me, profoundly confused by my easy compliance, wondering why her monumental kill felt so incredibly hollow and empty. My personal office was a carefully curated sanctuary of controlled, productive chaos, a stark contrast to the sterile, lifeless minimalism of the main boardroom I had just departed. That Rolodex was, quite ironically, the single most valuable object in the entire glass and steel building. Chloe Vance, in her profound, arrogant ignorance, likely assumed that absolutely everything of value was meticulously digitized and stored on the company's secure servers. She fundamentally did not understand that in the rarefied, high-stakes world of multi-billion-dollar corporate mergers, the real binding deals were rarely made via email. They were forged on personal cellular numbers quickly scribbled onto the backs of damp cocktail napkins and secured through private business cards kept safely inside distressed leather binders. I did not rush. Rushing strongly implies a sense of guilt, or at the very least, a rising tide of panic. I possessed neither of those emotions at that moment. I opened my heavy desk drawers with the slow, deliberate precision of a highly trained bomb disposal technician working on a delicate mechanism. First, I gathered my personal, irreplaceable items. I carefully packed the silver-framed photograph of my late father, a man who had spent his life teaching me that while personal integrity is often incredibly expensive, the stench of desperation always costs significantly more. Next, I retrieved the heavy crystal paperweight that Elias Thorne had personally given me after we successfully closed a massive infrastructure deal 5 years ago. I dropped it gently into my distressed leather tote bag. It landed at the bottom with a heavy, deeply satisfying thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my dedicated assistant, Rachel, hovering anxiously in the open doorway. She was visibly pale, her hands nervously twisting a white tissue until it resembled shredded confetti. She whispered my name, asking if it was actually true. Speaking so softly, it was as if she believed speaking at a normal volume might somehow summon the destructive demon back from the hallway. I kept my voice incredibly soft and reassuring, confirming to Rachel that it was indeed true. I calmly picked up a massive stack of thick manila folders, the preliminary due diligence reports and financial projections for the impending Elias Thorne merger. I held the heavy stack in my hands for a long second, feeling their physical weight. These documents were the official company copies. Technically and legally, they belonged to Vanguard Peak. I set them deliberately back down on the desk, placing them squarely in the exact center of the blotter. Rachel stammered, her eyes wide with rising terror, reminding me that the critical merger meeting was scheduled in exactly 2 days. She frantically pointed out that absolutely nobody else in the entire firm understood the complex leverage ratios, and that nobody else had any knowledge whatsoever of the highly sensitive appendix clauses. I smiled warmly at her, stating that I was completely certain Chloe Vance was extremely capable. The blatant lie tasted incredibly sweet on my tongue, like a drop of refined cyanide. I then turned my attention to my computer terminal. I formally logged out of the highly encrypted corporate server, severing my digital connection to the firm. I meticulously wiped the local cache on the machine. I was absolutely not destroying any official company property. I was far too smart to invite a lawsuit for corporate sabotage. I was simply, legally, and permanently removing my personal intellectual footprint from their systems. If the firm desperately wanted to navigate the complex, treacherous labyrinth of the Thorn deal, they would have to do it using the standard, generic maps they possessed on file, and not the intricate, unrecorded shortcuts stored solely in my head. I slowly put on my coat. It was a heavy, luxurious cashmere blend, feeling incredibly soft and warm against the sudden, biting chill of the office's aggressive air conditioning system. I securely picked up my heavy leather tote bag. When I finally stepped out of my private office and into the main bullpen, the entire floor of analysts and junior partners was fiercely pretending to work. Every single head was bowed intensely over a keyboard, but countless pairs of eyes were darting nervously in my direction. The silence in the massive room was absolutely deafening. It was the specific, horrifying silence of a loyal crew silently watching their veteran captain being violently thrown overboard by a foolish mutineer who had absolutely no idea how to read a navigational compass. Chloe Vance was already waiting for me by the main bank of elevators. She had her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her foot tapping impatiently against the marble floor. She was flanked on either side by 2 incredibly uncomfortable-looking corporate security guards. I knew both of them by name. Chloe sharply snapped at the guards, ordering them to make absolutely certain that I did not take any proprietary corporate data with me. Stan, the veteran head of floor security, looked at me with deeply apologetic, sorrowful eyes. Stan mumbled quietly to Chloe, assuring her that I was completely clean without even making a pretense of checking my leather bag. Chloe loudly scoffed, rolling her eyes, and demanded that they simply get me out of the building, stating she wanted my alleged toxicity removed from her floor immediately. I stopped calmly in front of the polished steel elevator doors and confidently pressed the call button. I waited patiently for the inevitable ding. When the heavy doors finally slid open with a soft hum, I turned slowly to face Chloe. Instead, I offered her a smile. It was a completely genuine, bright smile. It was the exact kind of warm smile you might give to someone who has unknowingly just handed you a multi-million-dollar winning lottery ticket while they firmly believe they are handing you a minor parking citation. Her brow furrowed deeply, the sudden, sharp confusion momentarily cracking her carefully constructed mask of arrogant superiority. She defensively demanded to know what I was the reason for my gratitude. I smoothly replied that I was thanking her for so clearly clarifying the true priorities of the organization, stating that the entire experience had been profoundly illuminating. I took a confident step backward into the waiting elevator car. The heavy steel doors slid firmly shut, cleanly cutting off her face, precisely as the first raw, icy tendrils of genuine panic started to visibly creep into her wide eyes. As the high-speed elevator rapidly descended toward the ground floor, gravity pulled heavily at my stomach, but my spirit soared higher than it had in over a decade. It was exactly 15 minutes past 10 in the morning. By noon, the massive legal department would start asking very pointed, uncomfortable questions. By 2 in the afternoon, the senior partners would be completely confused and demanding answers, and by tomorrow morning, the catastrophic, uncontrollable hemorrhage of the firm's reputation and stock price would officially begin. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped directly into the bright, blinding sunshine of the bustling city. I did not bother to hail a cab. I walked deliberately for 2 long blocks until I found a quiet, unassuming cafe tucked away from the chaotic main avenues. I ordered a double espresso and sat heavily by the large front window, watching the frantic pace of the city move past me. I reached into my leather bag, took out my cellular phone, and powered it completely down. It was a simple, decisive action. I intended to let them sit in the deafening, terrifying silence for a good long while. I stood for hours staring intensely at massive abstract expressionist paintings, observing how sheer chaos could be so elegantly contained within rigid wooden frames, and I felt a profound, unexpected sense of kinship with the artwork. It was genuinely amazing how much intricate, beautiful detail you entirely missed in the world when you were constantly busy carrying the crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar corporation squarely on your exhausted shoulders. For the absolute first time in over a decade, I actually noticed the physical texture of the oil paint, the aggressive, sweeping brushstrokes, and the profound, peaceful silence of a room where nobody was demanding a revised financial forecast. It was not until exactly 6 in the evening, when I was finally back in the quiet sanctuary of my own apartment, pouring a generous glass of expensive red wine, that I finally decided to turn my phone back on. The device immediately buzzed in my hand like an incredibly angry, trapped hornet. It did not stop violently vibrating for a full 2 minutes. The screen illuminated the dim room with a massive cascade of urgent notifications, a relentless digital avalanche of corporate regret. There were 14 missed calls directly from the main office. Rachel had left 3 desperate voicemails. There were 5 missed calls from an unknown number, and there were 27 brand new emails sitting in my inbox. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, savoring the rich, complex tannins, and began scrolling casually through the frantic text messages. The first was from Rachel, sent at exactly 11:30 in the morning. She frantically reported that the legal department, the department, had just stormed down to the floor, aggressively demanding to know exactly who had officially authorized my sudden termination. She noted that Chloe was currently locked securely inside her new office, refusing to come out. Rachel stated that the senior partners from the Tokyo firm had attempted to call me directly, but Chloe had intercepted the call. Apparently, the conversation had not gone well. Rachel noted that there had been a tremendous amount of screaming in Japanese on the other end of the line. The final text from Rachel, sent at 2:30, was pure, distilled panic. She demanded to know where the critical appendix files were located. Chloe was reportedly screaming at the information technology department, accusing me of maliciously deleting them, while the technicians repeatedly confirmed that those specific files had never actually existed on any company server. Rachel ended the message by stating that absolutely everyone was completely freaking out. I smiled softly to myself, gently swirling the dark wine in my glass. Of course, those critical files were not stored on the corporate server. The appendix files were never formal, typed documents. They were the subtle, unwritten nuances of the deal. They were the complex handshake agreements regarding the retention of key executive staff in the acquired company. They were the binding, verbal promises I had personally made to Elias Thorne regarding the careful preservation of his family's legacy branding. Those critical details were safely stored in the extensive notes I always took entirely by hand, notes that were currently sitting in the cold fireplace of my apartment, slowly turning into gray ash. I calmly opened a formal email from the firm's general counsel. David was fundamentally a good man, but he was notoriously spineless whenever he was forced to deal directly with the powerful board of directors. The subject line screamed urgency, citing a massive misunderstanding regarding my employment status and protocol enforcement. David pleaded with me to call him immediately, insisting that we desperately needed to discuss a full reinstatement of my lucrative contract long before the crucial Thorne meeting. He desperately promised that we could easily smooth this entire situation over, weakly suggesting that Chloe was simply new and perhaps a bit overzealous. And he practically begged me not to let temporary emotions completely derail the massive merger. I whispered the word emotions to the empty room. They always eagerly called it emotions when an employee reacted to being mistreated, but they always called it brilliant strategy when a ruthless executive did the exact same thing. I chose not to reply. I could picture the chaotic scene at the office perfectly in my mind. The sun would be rapidly setting, casting long, accusing shadows across the expensive open floor plan. Chloe would be completely exhausted, her cheap jasmine perfume turning stale, her expensive white power suit heavily wrinkled. She would be slowly, painfully realizing that her title commanded forced obedience, but absolutely zero genuine respect, and certainly no practical knowledge. She possessed the basic files, she had the raw numbers. She could clearly see that the massive valuation was $3 billion. But she fundamentally did not know why. She did not know that the third clause hidden deep within Section 5, the clause specifically concerning environmental liabilities, was actually a highly coded, delicate negotiation, a specific plot of land in Nevada that Elias Thorne's grandfather had originally purchased. On paper, it looked like a massive financial liability, but it was the true emotional heart of the entire deal for the fiercely proud Thorne family. Any generic business school graduate would immediately attempt to renegotiate that specific clause to save the firm money, which would inevitably insult Elias so deeply that he would walk away from the table before the morning coffee was even poured. The vibrant city lights twinkled outside my window, completely indifferent to the absolute panic consuming the glass tower downtown. This one was from a number I did not have saved in my contacts, but I instantly recognized the specific area code. It was the heavily guarded private line of Vanguard Peak's chief financial officer, Martin. The message arrived at exactly 7:15. Martin demanded that I pick up the phone immediately, and he bluntly told me to name my price. I stared at the glowing message. Name your price. My required price was not money. My price was basic professional dignity. And unfortunately for them, dignity was a rare currency that they had just foolishly devalued to absolute zero. I placed the phone face down on the heavy wooden coffee table. I was absolutely not going to save them. Not tonight. Tonight, I was going to relax and watch a movie. The panic felt very quiet from my living room, but I knew with absolute certainty that by tomorrow morning it would be screaming. There is a highly specific, reinforced drawer in my desk at home that always remains securely locked. It does not contain expensive jewelry or stacks of emergency cash. It contains pure, unadulterated leverage. I walked purposefully over to the antique writing desk, nestled in the corner of my living room, and retrieved a small, heavy brass key hidden carefully underneath a decorative, succulent plant. The heavy lock clicked open with a deep, mechanical satisfaction. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet lining, was a single, heavily worn leather-bound folder. It smelled strongly of old quality paper and faint tobacco smoke. Embossed on the front cover in fading gold leaf were the distinct words denoting the highly confidential legacy protocol of the Thorne Family Trust. Most people in the industry incorrectly assumed I was hired by Vanguard Peak solely because of my impressive resume. The absolute truth was that I was a crucial part of the original package. He demanded a senior liaison who truly understood the quiet power of old money. He did not want the loud, flashy, obnoxious wealth of modern technology billionaires. He wanted the quiet, intensely guarded wealth that moves in slow centuries, not frantic financial quarters. My own father had been the trusted personal attorney for the father of Elias. I was not merely an employee. I was the essential bridge between two vastly different worlds. I was the vital translator between the cold, predatory, ruthless capitalism of my current firm and the fierce, almost feudal loyalty of the Thorne family. I slowly opened the leather binder. Inside was a single, crisp sheet of paper with a direct private telephone number. It was absolutely not a standard business line. Calling this specific number was the absolute nuclear option. It blatantly breached every single strict confidentiality clause embedded in my extensive employment contract. It was professional suicide. But then I vividly remembered the smug, arrogant look on Chloe's face. I remembered the exact way she had looked at my bespoke blazer as if it were a dangerous contagion. I remembered the sheer audacity of her firing me in front of the very people I had spent years mentoring. It rang exactly twice before a voice answered. It was a deep, gravelly voice, instantly familiar and commanding absolute respect. I identified myself, keeping my voice perfectly steady. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end, a distinct shift in the airwaves. He noted that he believed we were in a strict quiet period until the official signing scheduled for Friday. I confirmed that we were, but I calmly informed him that the underlying parameters of the deal had drastically changed. The warmth instantly drained from his voice, rapidly replaced by the cold, unyielding steel of a man who owned massive shipping fleets. He demanded to know exactly how they had changed. I clearly stated that I had been officially terminated. He finally repeated the word, making it sound entirely foreign and unacceptable in his mouth. He demanded to know exactly who had authorized it. I told him it was the new vice president's chief of staff, citing a ridiculous dress code violation and a supposed misalignment of corporate culture. He asked who was currently handling the highly sensitive transition of the Nevada water rights assets. I bluntly informed him that absolutely nobody was handling it, because Chloe genuinely believed the basic files on the server were entirely sufficient. I heard a low rumbling sound that might have been a dark laugh or a dangerous growl. He noted that the files on the server incorrectly listed the Nevada property as non-revenue generating acreage, and that without my specific addendum, their algorithm would automatically flag it for liquidation within 6 months. I confirmed he was correct, adding that they had foolishly fired the only person who knew the truth just 2 days before the biggest merger in their history. Elias dropped his voice to a low, conspiratorial whisper and asked if I was free for breakfast the following morning. I replied that since I was currently unemployed, I was free all day. He instructed me to meet him at his favorite luxury hotel at exactly 8 in the morning, firmly commanding me not to sign any severance package or non-disclosure agreement with Vanguard Peak. I assured him I would not dream of it. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. The apartment felt entirely different now. It was no longer a quiet refuge, but an active war room. The hotel served breakfast with the kind of hushed, terrifying efficiency that always makes you feel like you are actively plotting a massive corporate coup, which in a very real way we absolutely were. Elias looked exactly as he always did, flawlessly immaculate in a dark navy suit, his silver hair perfectly swept back, possessing eyes that had seen absolutely everything and were impressed by almost none of it. We did not waste time discussing the weather or the menu. He informed me that Vanguard Peak had called his team that morning, and a frantic woman named Chloe had breathlessly lied, claiming I was suddenly hospitalized with severe exhaustion but had fully briefed her on every detail of the massive deal. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. If I was genuinely sick, the deal could legally be delayed. But if I was fired, the specific key man clause in the contract would instantly trigger a total voiding of the exclusivity agreement. Elias smiled a dangerous shark-like grin. He bluntly stated that he did not do business with amateurs, and he certainly never did business with liars. He declared that the massive deal with Vanguard Peak was entirely dead. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. It was not a merger agreement. It was a highly lucrative consultancy contract. He was officially hiring me as his director of strategic acquisitions, offering double my previous salary and significant equity. I eagerly accepted, signing the papers on the spot. He then revealed his master plan. He had not officially canceled the meeting at Vanguard Peak yet. He wanted me waiting in the lobby to be the absolute last thing Chloe saw before her entire career evaporated. The grand lobby of Vanguard Peak was aggressively designed to intimidate visitors. It featured 3 sweeping stories of imported Italian marble and a massive cascading waterfall. I walked quietly across the polished floor, stopping 20 feet away from the security turnstiles. The scene played out perfectly. Elias Thorne stood like an immovable stone statue in the center of the atrium. Chloe Vance was standing before him, frantically flanked by Martin, the chief financial officer, and David, the general counsel. Elias stared at her without blinking. He calmly reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out his phone, and noted that her statement was incredibly strange, considering he had just received a text message from me stating that the coffee across the street was absolutely excellent. Chloe instantly froze, all the blood rapidly draining from her terrified face. Elias slowly turned his head, scanning the massive lobby until his sharp eyes landed squarely on me. He did not smile. He simply gave a short, acknowledging nod. Chloe spun around in sheer panic. She saw me standing there, perfectly healthy, incredibly calm, and tightly holding my distressed leather tote bag. The heavy silence that immediately followed was dense enough to crush a car. She stammered wildly, pointing a violently shaking finger in my direction, frantically blurting out that she had fired me. The absolute truth violently vomited out of her before she could even attempt to stop it. Elias looked at Chloe with pure, unadulterated disgust. He loudly berated her for lying to his legal team, lying to her own board of directors, and foolishly firing the sole project lead merely 48 hours before the critical closing over a ridiculous dress code violation. He turned sharply to Martin, aggressively questioning if this was the horrific standard of leadership he was expected to invest his billions into. Martin frantically pleaded, offering to reinstate me immediately with a massive bonus. Elias raised a hand, instantly silencing the desperate man. He turned to me and formally asked if I was currently employed by Vanguard Peak. I took a confident step forward and clearly stated that my employment had been permanently terminated for cause. Elias then turned back to the trembling group and loudly declared that the meeting was officially over, stating that term sheets were always entirely contingent on basic good faith, which they had utterly failed to demonstrate. He turned on his heel and confidently walked out the revolving doors. The very moment he left, the entire lobby exploded in chaos. Martin screamed at Chloe, threatening to personally sue her for a massive breach of fiduciary duty. She burst into jagged tears and ran toward the elevators. Martin then turned his desperate plastic smile toward me, begging me to name my price to fix the catastrophe. I looked at the man I had served for a decade and calmly reached into my bag. I pulled out my new contract and informed him that he could not rehire me because I was officially the new director of strategic acquisitions for the Thorne family. I watched his face completely collapse as the realization hit him like a physical blow. 3 days later, Vanguard Peak stock had plummeted 18%. The board begged Elias for one final meeting, offering massive concessions. We returned to the boardroom, but Elias was not there to merge. He offered to buy their distressed assets for 30 cents on the dollar, citing their catastrophic lack of leadership and the critical environmental risks that only I truly understood. They looked at me with deep betrayal, desperately begging me to come back and fix it. I looked at Chloe, who was now sitting silently in a drab gray dress, completely defeated. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute victory. I told them there was no deal because she had fired me. We walked out, leaving the smoking wreckage of their corporate empire behind us, and for the very first time in 15 years, I finally, truly exhaled.